Thurgood Marshall, the subject of the recently released Hollywood film Marshall, was best known for being the first African American appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. While the film did a good job of showcasing Marshall as a young, savvy black lawyer at a time when the average white American didn't even know that there were black attorneys, it failed to portray Marshall's importance to the civil rights movement. No problem. The Missing Pages is here to help. Thurgood Marshall was born July 2, 1908, in Baltimore, Maryland. His parents, Norma, a school teacher, and William Marshall, a railroad porter, were forward thinkers. In a time when black parents prepared their children for a blue-collar life in a segregated society where opportunities for blacks were severely limited, Marshall's parents stressed education and self-empowerment. This philosophy would guide Marshall throughout his life. His early years were fairly common for a black child in Baltimore. He grew up in a black neighborhood and attended segregated black schools, including Frederick Douglass High School. Thurgood was a bright student. He graduated high school a year early. Marshall attended Lincoln University, a Negro college in Pennsylvania. There he met such notable figures as Langston Hughes and Cab Calloway. Early in Marshall's collegiate career, he wasn't known as a serious student. However, things seemed to change for Marshall following a sit-in at a local segregated movie theater. That same year, he was initiated into the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, a fraternal organization founded for and by black men. Marshall went on to graduate cum laude with a degree in humanities. While at Lincoln, Marshall had the desire to study law. His goal was to attend the University of Maryland Law School in his hometown. Unfortunately, the school's admission policy made that impossible, so instead, Marshall applied and was accepted to the Howard University School of Law in Washington, D.C. Ironically, Marshall would later be instrumental in overturning the University of Maryland's admissions policy. Highly motivated by his experience at Lincoln and by his growing distaste for the socioeconomic plight of African Americans, Marshall made the most of his time at Howard University. While at Howard, he fell under the tutelage of Charles Hamilton Houston, the law school's dean. Thurgood would graduate number 1 in the class of 1933. Following his graduation, Marshall returned to Baltimore and started his own law practice. It was during this time that Marshall was hired by the NAACP to represent Donald Murray in an anti-discrimination case. Murray, a well-qualified graduate of Amherst College, had been denied entrance to the University of Maryland Law School because of his race. Marshall won the court ruling against the school. That ruling was later challenged and eventually upheld in the state of Maryland Supreme Court. Impressed by Marshall's skill, the NAACP later made Marshall a permanent part of the staff. There he joined his former dean and mentor, Charles Houston. During Marshall's long and fruitful tenure with the NAACP, he would try a long list of cases where African Americans were either wrongfully accused of a crime or denied access to services because of race. Perhaps even more important than winning individual cases was Marshall's role as a mentor to a growing number of young civil rights attorneys. Thurgood racked up an impressive win record in discrimination cases. In doing so, he set a series of legal precedents that would later allow him to take on the ultimate challenge. What is a precedent? A legal precedent is a court ruling that lays the foundation for future court decisions in similar cases. In plain English, a precedent is an example. The American legal system depends heavily on the use of precedents. The problem is, the Constitution simply does not cover every possible situation where a law needs to be passed or a decision needs to be made. The major gaps are covered when a constitutional amendment is passed. However, passing an amendment is a long, slow process. Meanwhile, the courts need to make decisions on a daily basis. So when there's no law that covers a particular situation, the court has to have a way of making a decision. They do so by trying to interpret the spirit of the law based on what is clearly stated in the law. When a court is forced to make a ruling of this kind, that ruling then becomes the foundation of future decisions. The ruling is referred to as a precedent. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP set out to end the practice of racial segregation as protected by law. To do that, the NAACP would need to find a way to have segregation in the public sector declared unlawful. With that goal in mind, the NAACP commissioned a Harvard Law graduate by the name of Nathan Margold to study the problem. Margold authored a report that still bears his name. This report concluded that the best place to challenge the practice of segregation was in the realm of publicly funded primary and secondary schools. Marshall absorbed every word of the Margold report. Houston, also a believer in the report, used it to form the basis of the strategy that Marshall would use to systematically attack the legal protection of segregation in public education. At the heart of the matter was a Supreme Court ruling in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson. This was the case that legitimized segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal. The concept was that anything in the public sector could remain segregated so long as blacks had access to the same goods and services as whites. This gave rise to such things as white and colored water fountains, separate restrooms, and white and colored schools and colleges. It also gave rise to colored and white sections of trains and buses. The only way the NAACP could effectively end the legal protection of segregation was to find a way to strike down the Plessy-Ferguson decision. The Margold report suggested that the key was the 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws.
Derived from that is the belief that government-funded resources had to be available to all citizens. By definition, that meant public education. Marshall and his team of lawyers went about the business setting a number of precedents that could later be used to overturn the Plessy-Ferguson decision. Marshall, armed with a series of precedents that he and other civil rights attorneys set in the lower courts, led a group of attorneys representing various plaintiffs with similar complaints to the U.S. Supreme Court. Marshall, having the most experience, was named chief counsel for the group of plaintiffs. Citing the 14th Amendment and a list of instances where lower courts ruled against segregation in related cases, Marshall presented the argument that in education there was no such thing as separate but equal. Because education is rooted in the interaction of students with each other, the instructional separation of any racial group of students from the mainstream group was inherently harmful. That was a violation of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. After an arduous deliberation process, the Supreme Court eventually rendered the unanimous decision that made segregation in public education unlawful. For Marshall, the NAACP, and America's black population, this ruling was a resounding victory. As Marshall and Houston predicted, the decision turned out to be the crack that eventually broke the back of legal racial segregation in America. As for Thurgood Marshall, he was just getting started. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy appointed Marshall to the U.S. Court of Appeals. In 1965, he was appointed to the position of Solicitor General of the United States by President Lyndon Johnson. At the time, it was the highest government position ever held by an African American. He served until the retirement of Justice Tom C. Clark of the U.S. Supreme Court. President Johnson then made the nomination of Marshall to the Supreme Court. On August 30, 1967, the Senate confirmed Marshall's appointment, making him the first African American to ever serve on the court. Supposedly, President Johnson was quoted as saying that it was the right thing to do, the right time to do it, the right man, and the right place. Marshall served on the Supreme Court until he retired in 1991. He passed away in 1993 near his home in Bethesda, Maryland. He was 84 years old.